brothers.
I have.
But kept them under close eye, calculating what he would have to do to reach them as soon as they started their attack. The Bishop of Florence, meanwhile, had taken his place before the high altar, and the Mass began. It was at the point when the bishop was blessing the bread and wine that Ezio noticed Francesco and Bernardo exchange glances. The Medici family was seated just in front of them. At the same moment, the priests Bagnoni and Maffei, on the lower steps of the altar and closest to Lorenzo and Giuliano, looked round surreptitiously. The bishop turned to face the congregation, raised aloft the golden goblet, and started to speak. The blood of Christ. Then everything happened at once. Baroncelli sprang to his feet with a cry of "Creapa traditore!" and plunged a dagger into Giuliano's neck from behind. A fountain of blood spewed from the wound, showering Fioretta, who fell screaming to her knees. "Let me finish the bastard!" yelled Francesco, elbowing Baroncelli aside and throwing Giuliano, who was trying to staunch his wound with his hands, to the floor. Francesco knelt astride him and plunged his dagger over and over again into his victim's body in such a frenzy that once, without seeming to notice, he drove his weapon into his own thigh. Giuliano was long dead before Francesco had struck him the 19th and last blow. Meanwhile, Lorenzo, with a cry of alarm, had spun round to face his brother's attackers, while Clarice and the nurses bundled the children and Fioretta to safety. There was confusion everywhere. Lorenzo had spurned the idea of having his bodyguards close. A murderous attack in a church was a thing all but unheard of, but now they struggled to reach him through the mass of confused and panic-stricken worshippers, jostling and trampling each other in order to get away from the scene of butchery. But the situation was made far worse by the heat and the fact that there was scarcely any room to move at all, except for the area immediately in front of the altar. The bishop and his attendant priests stood aghast, rooted to the spot, but Bagnoni and Maffei, seeing Lorenzo's back turned to them, seized their opportunity and, drawing daggers from their robes, fell on him from behind. Priests are rarely experienced killers, and however noble they believed their cause to be, the two managed only to give Lorenzo flesh wounds before he shook them off. But in the struggle, they got the better of him again, and now Francesco, limping from his self-inflicted wound, but empowered by all the hatred that was boiling within him, was closing in too, roaring imprecations as he came, raising his dagger. Bagnoni and Maffei, unmanned by what they had done, turned and fled in the direction of the apse. But Lorenzo was staggering, blood pouring from him, and a cut high on the right shoulder had made his sword arm useless. "Your day is done, Lorenzo!" Francesco screamed. "Your entire misbegotten family dies by my sword!" "Infame!" returned Lorenzo. "I'll kill you now!" "With that arm?" sneered Francesco, and raised his dagger to strike. As his fist plunged down, a strong hand caught his wrist and arrested its motion before flinging him round. Francesco found himself looking into the face of another sworn enemy. "Ezio!" he growled. "You? Here?" "It's your day that is done, Francesco." The crowd was clearing, and Lorenzo's guards were pushing closer. Baroncelli had arrived at Francesco's side. "Come, we must fly, it's over," he shouted. "I'll deal with these curs first," said Francesco, but his face was drawn. His own wound was bleeding hard. "No, we must retreat." Francesco looked furious, but there was agreement in his face. "This isn't over," he told Ezio. "No, it isn't. Wherever you go, I will follow, Francesco, until I have cut you down." Glaring, Francesco turned and followed Baroncelli, who was already vanishing behind the high altar. There had to be a door out of the cathedral in the apse. Ezio prepared to follow. "Wait," a broken voice behind him said. "Let them go. They won't get far. I need you here. I need your help." Ezio turned to see the Duke sprawled on the ground between two overturned chairs. Not far away, his family huddled and wept. Clarice, a look of horror on her face, embracing her two oldest children tightly. Fioretta was staring dully in the direction of Giuliano's twisted and mangled corpse. Lorenzo's guards had arrived. "Look after my family," he told them. "The city will be in uproar over this. Get them to the palazzo and bar the doors." He turned to Ezio. "You saved my life." "I did my duty. Now the Pazzi must pay the full price." Ezio helped Lorenzo up and placed him gently on a chair. Looking up, he saw that the bishop and the other priests were nowhere to be seen. Behind him, people were still pushing and shoving, clawing at each other to get out of the cathedral by the main western doors. "I must go after Francesco," he said. "No," said Lorenzo, "I can't make it to safety on my own. You must help me. Get me to San Lorenzo. I have friends there." Ezio was torn, but he knew how much Lorenzo had done for his own family. He could not blame him for failing to prevent the deaths of his kinsmen, for how could anyone have predicted the suddenness of that attack? And now Lorenzo himself was the victim. He was still alive too, but he would not be for long unless Ezio could get him to the nearest place where he could be treated. The church of San Lorenzo was only a short distance northwest of the baptistry. He bound Lorenzo's wounds as best he could with strips torn from his own shirt. Then he lifted him gently to his feet. "Put your left arm round my shoulder. Good. Now, there must be a way out beyond the altar." They hobbled in the direction their assailants had taken, and soon came to a small, open door with bloodstains on its threshold. This was, no doubt, the way Francesco had gone. Might he be lying in wait? It would be hard for Ezio to release his spring-blade dagger, still less fight, while supporting Lorenzo on his right side, but he had his metal bracer strapped to his left forearm. They made their way into the square outside the north wall of the cathedral and were greeted with scenes of confusion and chaos. They made their way west along the side of the cathedral after Ezio had paused to wrap his cape over Lorenzo's shoulders in a makeshift attempt to disguise him. In the piazza between the cathedral and the baptistry, groups of men wearing the liveries of the Pazzi and the Medici were engaged in hand-to-hand combat, so engrossed that Ezio was able to slink past them. But as they reached the street that led up to the Piazza San Lorenzo, they were confronted by two men wearing the dolphin and crosses insignia. Both carried ugly-looking falchions. "Halt!" one of the guards said. "Where do you think you're going?" "I must get this man to safety," said Ezio. "And who might you be?" said the second guard unpleasantly. He came forward and peered at Lorenzo's face. Lorenzo, half fainting, turned away, but as he did so the cape slipped, revealing the Medici crest on his doublet. "Oh-ho!" said the second guard, turning to his friend. "Looks like we might have caught a very big fish here, Terzago." Ezio's brain raced. He couldn't let go of Lorenzo, who was still losing blood, but if he didn't, he couldn't use his weapon. He raised his left foot quickly and gave the guard a shove in the arse. He fell, sprawling. In seconds, his mate came for them, falchion raised. As the blade came down, Ezio parried and, using his wrist guard, deflected the blow. As he did so, he swung his left arm, forcing the sword away, cutting at the man with the double-bladed dagger attached to the wrist guard, though he could not get enough purchase to kill the man with it. And now the second guard was on his feet again, coming to the aid of his comrade, who in turn had staggered back, surprised that he had not cut Ezio's forearm off. Ezio stopped the second blade in the same way, but this time he managed to run the wrist guard down the cutting edge of the sword until it hit the hilt, bringing his hand in range of the man's wrist. He seized and twisted it so rapidly and hard that the man let go of his weapon with a sharp cry of pain. Stooping quickly, Ezio grabbed the falchion almost before it had hit the ground. It was hard, working with his left hand and encumbered by Lorenzo's weight, but he slashed it round and cut halfway through the guard's neck before he could recover. The second guard was coming at him again now, bellowing with anger. Ezio parried with his falchion, and he and the guard cut and thrust at each other several times. But the guard, unaware still of the concealed metal bracer on Ezio's left arm, aimed blow after useless blow at it. Ezio's arm ached and he could barely keep on his feet, but at last he saw an opportunity. The man's helmet had worked loose, but the man was unaware of this and was looking down at Ezio's forearm, preparing to aim another blow at it. Swiftly, Ezio flicked his own blade up, feinting as though he had missed, but actually he succeeded in knocking the helmet off the man's head. Then, before he could react, Ezio slammed the heavy falchion down on the man's skull and split it in two. The falchion stuck there, and Ezio was unable to work it loose. The man stood stock still for a moment, his eyes still wide with surprise, before crumpling to the dust. Looking quickly around, Ezio hauled Lorenzo up the street. "Not much farther, Altezza." They reached the church without further annoyance, but the doors were firmly shut against them. Ezio, looking back, saw at the end of the street that the bodies of the guards he'd killed had been discovered by a group of their comrades, who were now looking in their direction. He hammered on the doors, and a spy hole opened in it, revealing an eye and part of a suspicious face. "Lorenzo's been wounded," Ezio gasped. "They're coming for us. Open the door." "I need the password," said the man within. Ezio was at a loss, but Lorenzo had heard the sound of the man's voice, and recognizing it, he rallied. "Angelo," he said loudly, "it's Lorenzo! Open the fucking door!" "By the thrice greatest," said the man within, "we thought you must be dead." He turned and yelled at someone unseen, "Get this thing unbolted, and fast!" The spy hole closed, and there was a sound of bolts quickly being drawn. Meanwhile, the Pazzi guardsmen, making their way up the street, had broken into a run. Just in time, one of the heavy doors swung open to admit Ezio and Lorenzo, and as quickly slammed shut behind them, the bolts shot back into place by the keepers in charge of them. There was a terrible noise of battle outside. Ezio found himself looking into the calm green eyes of a refined man of perhaps 24. "Angelo Poliziano," the man introduced himself. "I sent some of our men round the back way to intercept those Pazzi rats. They shouldn't give us any more trouble." "Ezio Auditore." "Ah, Lorenzo has spoken of you," he interrupted himself, "but we can talk later. Let me help you get him to a bench. We can take a look at his wounds there." "He's safe now," said Ezio, handing Lorenzo over to two attendants who gently guided him to a bench set against the north wall of the church.